Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to Canada today on Muslim Network TV with your host, Taha Ghayur. Every week we bring to you some interesting stories, interesting perspectives, and individuals who are accomplished, who are experts, or who have some beautiful stories to tell. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that some of you may be aware of, and however, many of you are not aware of the story behind this beautiful institution that we're going to be highlighting. And we're talking about the first institution of Canadian Muslims in Canada. And that is, of course, none other than Al-Rashid Mosque in Edmonton. Today, we're going to be highlighting some beautiful stories that are associated with the building and construction and establishment of this beautiful community in Alberta almost 80 plus years ago. And we're going to talk about the evolution of this institution as well as evolution of Canadian Muslim community, Canadian Muslim identity. And we're going to be speaking with a professor who actually knows a whole lot about this subject, something that a lot of people in our own community, in the Canadian Muslim community, may not be aware of. I'm happy to introduce to you Professor Earle Waugh. He studied philosophy at McMaster University and history of religions at the University of Chicago, where he specialized in Islam and indigenous traditions. And in 1969, he traveled to Egypt to study Arabic and Islamic culture at the American University in Cairo. After completing his PhD, he taught at Cleveland State University's Department of Religious Studies, and later he served as chair of religious studies in 1974 at the University of Alberta. Professor Waugh has spent over 4 decades researching and publishing some of the first Islamic studies in North America. And he has published several books, over 70 articles and texts on Islamic topics, and he has given thousands of presentations. Today, we are going to be talking to him about his amazing, and I would say pioneering book, called Al-Rashid Mosque, and we're going to be talking and exploring that book also a bit as we have a conversation with Professor Waugh. So thank you very much, Earle, for being here with us this morning, all the way from Alberta.
Well, actually, I'm not in Alberta now. I'm in Ontario.
Oh no, I didn't realize. Thank you for clarifying that.
I'm right around the corner from you in Niagara-on-the-Lake, actually.
Oh, nice, excellent. Great to see you. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Yeah.
So let's, take us back, Earle, to 1930s and share with us what Canada was like at that time and what was Muslim community like in 1930s in Canada?
Well, that's a great question because like most of Canada, it was in a much more truncated state than it is today. And especially in Alberta, what you still had was a leftover from the fur trade industry. And in fact, some of the earliest Muslims in that area came because they were following the fur trade and the kind of intellectual background that it had at the time. So Edmonton, as you probably know, originally was a fur trading center, and then it developed into an agricultural center. And at the time when the first Muslims came into the province, they came largely out of a connection from New York to Montreal, and then some of them picked up pots and pans out of Winnipeg and were delivering it to indigenous people across the north. And when Abu Ghosh chap, in fact, learned Cree and learned to speak Cree enough, so much so that he developed even some Cree names for his pots and pans that he was selling to indigenous communities across the north.
Hmm.
So the earliest people who came there, and the earliest what you would call pioneers in the community, were all entrepreneurs, and they had left Lebanon um, and the Bekaa Valley. They came there specifically because they wanted to, I guess, develop a whole new way of living, a whole new entrepreneurial attitude. So one of the things that your listeners might be interested in is that really Islam developed in this far western province because it was all entrepreneurs and business people who were looking for ways to develop, and so it was not unlike Christianity in Canada, which was spearheaded by the church and by priests and missionaries like that. Um, the Muslim experience in Canada has been highlighted by entrepreneurs, business people, people who were coming here to settle and to build families and to construct communities around their business interests. So one of the interesting things about the Alberta community is then that many of the Muslims in that area became very successful because from that time on, Edmonton began to flourish.
Mhm.
It flourished agriculturally, then it flourished when oil was discovered, and many of the individual people who came became fairly wealthy. They became developers. They became business people, and so you have to understand that the growth of Islam in Canada was, at least in this area, was initially linked to the successful business people that came from the Middle East. And I don't think everybody knows that. And I
Mhm.
certainly don't think that one of the issues of the way the community has developed in Canada has been highlighted as a business activity, not as an activity that was laid out by some religious motivation.
Hmm. Very interesting. You're right. I mean, and that is something that you don't hear about much. You do hear about some peddlers here and there, and among the early, pioneers in the Muslim community. But you don't look at, typically this is not how we talk about the early Muslims in Canada. And of course, as we know, much later on in late 1900s, especially starting 1970s, 80s, and 90s, that's where we saw, of course, a surge in Muslim diaspora, coming to Canada as, of course, professionals as well as entrepreneurs in different areas. So going back to 1930s, I mean, that's also a time of depression. So how were these Muslim merchants or business people or even farmers or faring at the time, of course, along with their fellow Canadians?
Well, that's an interesting issue because it's what I would call the leapfrog principle. Uh, Many people would have a friend or a relative or probably a close relative who was already in business in Montreal. And so they would pick up clothing or they would become textile merchants or something. They would move from Montreal to the West. And so there was a leapfrog initiative where somebody would contact somebody in the Middle East and say, hey, if you want an opportunity to develop, come here and we will help you get started. So many of the places like Lac La Biche, where it was one of the founding areas along with Edmonton of the Muslim community, was built by people who did that kind of leapfrog thing, and they used their connections both with Christian and with Muslim community members in Montreal, and it was a very interesting kind of process. I don't think we've really examined the full extent to to which this kind of thing worked in Canada, but from my early study, I would say this kind of leapfrog um, issue is one of the things that drove it.
Wow.
And then these interlocking connections with family and friends um, became a kind of hallmark of the way that the community developed in Western Canada.
Wow. That's
People can't believe that the first mosque was established in 1938, right? There were
Mhm.
other mosques. There was a mosque in New Jersey earlier on.
Mhm.
There was a mosque in Iowa
Yes.
that was established a little bit earlier, but none of those mosques exist now. That is
Mhm.
the building, whereas
Mhm.
the building that was built in 1938 and became what I would call the home of Islam in Alberta, that building still stands, and it's now preserved
Mhm.
in Fort Edmonton Park.
That's
So
amazing. You're right.
it's a very interesting process, and I think something that Muslims should be proud of. That they built an institution in what at that time must have been the far corners of the earth, and
Mhm.
I could just imagine if my son came to me and said, you know, I want to go 4,000 miles away so I can do some business with my uncle in Montreal or someplace.
Mhm.
I would say, look, what a harebrained idea that is.
Definitely very courageous and adventurous, no doubt.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit more about. Like, who are these people who finally thought of this idea of building an institution? I mean, how many Muslims were there to begin with in Edmonton and in Canada in mid or late 30s? And who were these individuals who decided to build that first mosque?
Well, the background of Edmonton is it was, as I said, a fur trading center. Then it became diversified with an agricultural focus, and it became a business center for northern Alberta. And as you probably know, Edmonton is kind of a gateway to the north, and so there were ways in which highways were linked to the northern part of the province and up into all the way to Alaska. In fact, so there it was a central connection from that economic standpoint. The people who came here then were focused entirely on building what I would call service industries, that is, um, serving for cultural goods like clothing and household wares and business activities, something like that. So the Hamden family, the Almiri family, all of these families came from that kind of focus. And the early concern of Edmonton was to serve the North. So the connection with the North was a critical part of the ideology of the Muslims who came here. They, we have now the idea that the North was a frigid place and that, very few people came there. But the fact of the matter is that the Muslims were not cowed by this northern cold image. They came because there were these opportunities for development. And many of the first people, like the Hamden family, for example, lived in Lac La Biche. And Lac La Biche is about 150 miles north of Edmonton. And so these people lived there, and they came to Edmonton. And the reason why what I would call the family generation came to Edmonton was because of education.
Mhm.
They were developing families. They realized that their families needed education, and
Mhm.
the educational system in Edmonton was well known throughout North America to be one of the strongest and one of the best organized. So they came to Edmonton primarily to give education to their children. So it was a family oriented drive that brought them to Edmonton. And then um, developing the institutional structure that would support families became the motivator behind building a mosque.
Mhm.
So we can see the steps then of an entrepreneur coming to Canada of building a family, of educational requirements, and then religious institutional structures. Now, in Edmonton at the time, there was large-scale Catholic development, Orthodox development, a very vigorous evangelical tradition with Methodism, and then there was, of course, the Anglican Church. So there was a vigorous kind of religious community there at the time, and the early Muslims made the case of, look, all of these chaps are here and they've got their own institutional forms, their own institutional structures. We need one. And everybody in the community said, well, why not? That seems reasonable. They want a place to worship the same as we have. But one of the keys to that was the early women who had the attitude that they were part and parcel of the community. Now, back then, they instituted what we would call family dinners, especially around Eids. And they would, and these women were fantastic cooks. Let's face it, they were absolutely brilliant in the kitchen. So they put on massive dinners, and everybody, Jews came, Christians came, unbelievers came. They just loved this food, and they enjoyed this kind of fellowship together. So it was always then the focal point was always on community. We are part of this community. Now, some Muslims now are aghast to know that in the basement of Al-Rashid's first mosque, they had a piano and they used to have dancing there. So there was community dancing that went on in this mosque. In addition to using the basement as a place of study and of learning, and place where they had dinners, they had what we would call community activities. And so there were a number of people who were involved in this kind of activity in Canada at the time. And so it was a focus entirely on developing community concerns that became, I think, one of the fulcrums of the formation of this community.
That's amazing. And I mean, it's interesting that, as you mentioned, I mean, they focus more initially on building the community around them.
That's right.
Muslim, non-Muslims, anybody around them that was part of their society and their neighborhoods. And then the idea, of course, of building an institution, and even that, even after they built it, was very much focused, as you said, on actually keeping the community together and really bringing life to community through this institution. So, and you mentioned a couple of family names. Who were the top 1 or 2 or 3 leaders who drove this initiative? As we know, there are a couple of them who actually went out and advocated, and they were not necessarily, men, stereotypical imams, or men with big white beard, knocked the doors, but it was somebody else. So who
sure was. I'm telling you, the lady that you should have met and had on your television show was Ellie Hamden. I mean, she was a dynamo. So when they wanted to build the mosque, first of all, they had to go to the city because the city had this plot that they would sell them. But she went to the mayor, and the mayor said, well, you guys need $5,000 to pay for this, and to pay for the lot. And then, they had to find money to pay for the building. Well, Ellie was smart. She had been behind many of the dinners. She was a very clever woman that way. She was well known in the community. So when she had to raise money, she went door to door in Edmonton. You know, you had the picture on there a while ago. She went door to door in the businesses in Edmonton and said, look, we need to raise money because we need to buy this land to build a mosque. And so she had support from the Jewish community. She had support from the Catholic community. You know, all of these business people knew that these people were genuine. They were good business people. They were successful. They worked every day with them. They saw their potential and they said, why not? So they chipped in. And so the mosque really was a community project. From there on, of course, the community sent people throughout Canada, especially to Winnipeg and across Saskatchewan, to raise funds from local people, and from there they went everywhere and collected funding to help them build this mosque. So it really was a Canadian mosque. It really had the backbone of it was really a Canadian institution with the goal not just of representing Islam, but being part of a religious community in Edmonton and in Canada. I admire them for this. I think this is extraordinary in the way in which religious communities have developed in Canada. And so that's one of the things that motivated me to write this book, because I think the Muslim community itself is not proud enough of what these old timers did. I think it's exceptional.
And your contribution is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, definitely pioneering work. And as you know, we were discussing earlier, this should have been written by one of the individual community members from the Edmonton Muslim community itself, or at least somebody from the Muslim community or some academic in the Muslim community. But the fact that you took this initiative and you're telling this story, well, almost 80 years later, 80 plus years later, is interesting, but at the same time, definitely phenomenal what you have done with it. So thank you so much for a very unique contribution. And Earle, continuing, sort of building on what you just said just a few minutes ago about, it became a unique Canadian story and Canadian community project, and definitely a very multicultural one in many ways. One of the things that strikes me and anybody who looks at this mosque, especially for the first time, is the structure itself. Tell us a little bit about, like, why does it look so different? I mean, why doesn't it have this typical dome and other features that we see in a typical mosque structure?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that the initial chap that they used to construct the mosque was a Ukrainian, and he actually had come through from Winnipeg, and he wasn't what I would call a dyed-in-the-wool Ukrainian Orthodox chap, but he was, I think, very much focused on what Ellie and the other people said was Middle Eastern. So he did have this kind of notion that we have to make this thing look like something that will be out of that area. But in my studies of this building, the early writing on the building, on him and on the way it was built, was that, well, okay, this was his influence. It was his Orthodox Ukrainian influence that built this mosque. But I don't think so. I think that this mosque, in some ways, looked like one of the first Methodist buildings that was built. It's built along the same line as the Methodist Church. It had the same kind of dimensions of an early Methodist church.
Interesting.
The only thing that was really distinctive about it, from that perspective, is, it had these two minarets that were on the front, and then the windows that looked kind of Ukrainian. And then it had a dome in it. The picture that you have on the screen now doesn't show the dome because they moved the mosque to its current location, and that dome had been taken down. But in my studies, where did these pillars come on each side? This has been a very distinctive motif because it was carried on in Lac La Biche when they built their mosque, and it's carried on in another mosque in Edmonton that's been built by another a sister group to this one. So this kind of shape with the domes on top, I think this. Some people said, "Oh, well, this is just an adaptation of the Orthodox tradition." No, not so. I think what it was, my own personal view is that these domes came from a picture that the Hamdan family had of a Lebanese mosque, and that the shape of the dome was probably mimicked on that.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So this is what I would call a composite structure. Part Methodist, part Orthodox, and part Muslim, and having a combination effect that has really stuck around for people. It's been extraordinary.
Absolutely. You're right. Well, so tell us a little bit about when it was first built. I mean, who were there as part of the inauguration? I mean, this must have been a big deal when it was inaugurated in 1938, December 1938.
Well, everybody from the community came for the opening of it, and they brought the writer of the translator of the Quran in to be the principal speaker and the inaugurator of it. And of course, his name has gone right out of my head.
Abdullah Yusuf Ali, the most famous.
Yusuf Ali, and he and of course he didn't belong to what we would call the Sunni tradition, right? And but this is another thing that you should know. In the early days, the distinction between Sunni and Shia was not significant, or it was not pushed as that significant.
In Canada, you mean?
In Canada. And so, I mean, because many of these people work together in their daily lives. And so, these kind of distinctions, they didn't feel were all of that significant. There was intermarriage between them, and there was interrelations between them domestically and business-wise. So early on, then they prayed together, and so the distinctions were not so significant and not so prevalent as you find in many Muslim communities. And so I think that helped to develop a kind of Canadian Islam, i.e., that what I would call the theological distinctions between Muslims were not placed, in the center of all discussions, and they were not significant in everyday life. You didn't have to force your point of view in order to feel that you were a part of this Muslim community.
That's amazing.
I think that has paid off, in that way later on, all of the Muslim communities got together and they funded a chair in Islamic studies at the University of Alberta. The community themselves did this.
That's
as
great.
far as I know, this is the only chair in Islamic studies that is funded by a corporate community Muslim group. All of the Muslim groups coming together, putting money into the pot and going to the university and saying, look, we want to have a chair in Islamic studies, put here and placed here permanently in our name. I think all of the other chairs in Harvard and wherever, all of these chairs in Texas are all by sultans or, rich chaps who want their name, on something. Not so here. This is a community, a Muslim community project.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing.
I think Muslims ought to be happy about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, sort of fast forward now to, let's say, 50 years after the inauguration of this mosque. We know that this mosque outgrew itself, and decision was made to just move out of it. And for almost 10 years, I believe that the original Al-Rashid Mosque was basically empty, sitting there, and it was pretty much deteriorating.
Yeah.
And then a group of young women who happened to be descendants of course, pioneers from that community decided to preserve it. Why do you think this was important to the next generation, or actually third generation even, of Edmonton Muslims to actually preserve this? What was the big deal about preserving the original site?
Well, one of the things that motivated the women was, first of all, there's a very activist tradition among women in the Muslim community going back to the Hamden women, right?
Yes.
The second thing is that Edmonton itself had focused on its own past tradition, going all the way back to its early days as a fur trading post. And so it had built this Edmonton Park, where it had placed many of the early buildings that had either been in terrible shape, and they decided to move them there and fix them up. So they made in what's called the Fort Edmonton Park, they built a replica of the first fort, along with the balustrade and all of the accoutrements of the fort. And then around it, they decided to put buildings from the early days that they were able to recuperate and to build there and replicate the early streets as a way of giving youngsters some sense of the history of the place. And that's been very, very popular. And so the ladies argued that this building is distinctive in North America and therefore should be preserved along with all of the other buildings that appeared in Fort Edmonton Park. Now, up to that time, of course, they had not yet had the opportunity to build a 1938 street. So they had earlier streets, the 1920s and all that, but they had not really got around to building a 1938 street. They just didn't have the funding for it. And so for the longest time, Al-Rashid, as you see there, sat on its lot. And then along came the hospital. Then there's a hospital next door, right? The Royal Alexandra Hospital. They said, look, that's prime building territory for us, and we need it. So the issue was, what are you going to do with the building that's sitting empty there? And of course, there was all kinds of people that says, well, just knock it down. We've knocked down lots of buildings, so it's not a big deal. Edmonton is known for knocking down all its historic buildings. And the ladies, led by Soraya Hafez and others, just said, wait a minute, this can't happen. We can't get rid of something this historic just like that. So they went to the city council, and of course, the city council is not necessarily the most sympathetic group to have these ladies come before them, but they went before them and they made a very, very positive case. And they said, look, this is historically as significant as anything you've got there. It's significant in North America.
Mhm.
It has a historical background and on and on and on. So, bottom line, the lady said, we'll raise the money.
Wow.
So, many of these women belong to the MCC, the Muslim Council, the Council of Muslim Women in Canada.
Mhm.
They drew on their contacts and they began putting together a proposal to move this mosque. And they did. I mean, I'm amazed. They
Wow.
got the funding together. It cost, I remember offhand just how much it was, but it was in the thousands, to
Yes.
move
Yep.
this mosque.
Significant amount. Yep.
Yeah, they had to do things like, get it across the river, and they had to, the light standards had to be taken up, and it was, what a pain it was, but I mean, really, they did it one night at 2 o'clock in the morning. and,
Wow.
the ladies drove behind it in their car to make sure that it got there. So it,
That's
it,
amazing. So
it's,
half
a,
a
it's,
century
quite
later,
it's a
something.
delightful story.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so
Half
they
a century
rebuilt
later,
it
you have
there.
a bunch of women again
Yeah.
uh, taking an initiative, advocating, fundraising, and preserving the oldest heritage site for the Canadian Muslim community for us to celebrate and for Canada to celebrate. And this is amazing to see that it is now part of Heritage Canada. So
Right.
now, just a couple of things as we come closer to our conclusion of our show. You talk about a lot of amazing facts and very interesting stories in your book. One of the things you talk about is how Al-Rashid Mosque stood the test of time. I mean, time and again, there were. I mean, this is one example that the mosque was abandoned because it outgrew itself, and then the preservation of the original mosque, and then the new mosque, of course, itself is probably outgrowing now. And the community is growing, and it's a dynamic community till this day. And then, of course, you had 9/11 that happened after that. You had the Quebec mosque shooting that happened, 3 years ago. I mean, there's so many things in between that happen, and so many trends. You talk about a lot of those things, at some point. So, wanted to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the evolution of this community, and why do you think this mosque actually survived almost a century now? As compared to many others that actually started off long, long time ago, and they are either still a very small community or they have not even survived in some cases.
Oh, a great question. Because of course, when you look back at the history of these people and where they came from, I mean, we look with sadness on Lebanon today, right? And Beirut, which was such a beautiful city where many of these people embarked from to come to Canada. Um, and the community has had its issues to deal with. They've had their problems. Early in Edmonton's history, there was a Ku Klux Klan movement there. Um, they also had to deal with the fallout from things in the Middle East, and whether or not they would be politicized because of what was going on in the Middle East. And I think your listeners might want to ponder this issue. How does Islam in Canada react to things like Israel and the problems that are facing the Palestinians? How are people in Canada and Muslims in Canada who are forward thinking and and some of them very wealthy, going to handle things like Wahhabism, and are going to handle things like what we would call the rigidity of the distinction between Sunni and Shia. And how are they going to handle things like the growth of minority traditions in Canada? I mean, all of these are controversial. And they did influence the people in the community. But what I have, my conclusion from my study from the community is that very early, they decided that they would be Canadian. That is, I hope I can articulate what I mean by that. They wanted to say, look, let's build a community that is sensitive to where it's at here. We cannot fight all of the problems that the Muslim community is facing in the world, nor can we react to issues like this, like Salafism and the growth of a conservative movement like jihadism. This is not part of our cultural tradition here. So we cannot then utilize these conflicts from around the world and these tensions from around the world and make them ours here, because they do not come by osmosis out of who we are and what we are. Mm. So there has been a very distinctive concern to be focused on building a community in Canada, building a community here that has tentacles everywhere and that feels the political pulse of Canada. Mm. Very early, they had connection with Pierre Trudeau. Mm. Very early, they had connection with people in the Middle East who helped them build the new Al-Rashid Mosque. Libya, for example, provided a huge amount of funds and still has some influence in the community. Well, you can see that the community could have been split in dozens of different ways over its history. But Taha, what I think is significant is this group has maintained its commitment to being a Canadian institution of Islam here. And sure, there have been members in the community that have thought, well, they didn't take a stand on this, or they didn't push for that, or they didn't go this way or do that. Very early, the boards of the mosque said, look, this is not our job. This is not what we are called to do here. And so they have built what I have called in the book a Canadian institution, a Canadian Islamic community. It's not one community. Their influence has spread all across this country and has been felt, in government institutions, has been felt all the way from here to Ottawa. It's a very significant kind of development. And so I think this kind of strategy has paid off in incredibly important ways.
You're right. And it's interesting that in your book also you talk about this distinct Canadian Muslim culture and identity. And I know you got a bit of flack for that too, as you were mentioning earlier at some point. Can you describe what that means? I mean, you did already touch on it now. Just right now, you just talked about, what made them unique in some ways. But when you say, unique Canadian Muslim identity, as compared to, let's say, other Muslim communities out there, what make them so unique in your opinion? I mean, what is it that you think even now that makes them unique?
Well, first of all, they emphasized education. The founding of this community was based on what we would call good, solid education. They have maintained a solid educational focus right from the very beginning, and have argued that Islam, first and foremost, is at the head of an educated public. So they have, as we can see that from the Islamic Academy that they have established now, one of the great Islamic schools in the city, and is a place now where families they really want their kids in there. And so so education is the first line of business for them. The second line of business for them is to provide for youngsters, that is, to provide an Islamic context for them to grow in. I mean, I don't think your listeners know that, for example, very early on, they had an Islamic hockey team. They had an Al-Rashid hockey team. The boys got together and played hockey.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's nothing more Canadian than a Canadian hockey team, I can tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they utilized the community assets, and they built around those things. Thirdly, they have also, I think, integrated with the community in other ways. They have discussions with Christians now about how to get together and how to deal with issues. They invite the community for Eid celebration. They give funding to students for universities. They encourage their students to go to university, and they have set up a fund for students to be given grants and to be given scholarships for university. They focus on what we would call community building activities together to foster an integration with the community, and not to be alienated by people who try to, for example, put pig's feet or something on their doorstep. They don't focus on those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
They could have rebelled. They could have turned inside. They could have been antagonized by some of the responses to 9/11. They did not. And you have to admire the single focus that they had to build a Canadian institution that is something to be proud of.
Absolutely. Well, I have two more questions, Professor Waugh, as we end. One question is, as we conclude, for our viewers, Muslims as well as our Canadian neighbors out there, as we also conclude Islamic History Month in Canada, why do you think anybody, Muslim or non-Muslim in Canada, Canadians in general, should learn about this very unique Canadian story?
Well, first of all, I think it's an element to be proud of. I mean, we have a peaceful community here. I mean, that's in sharp contrast to the kind of Islam that's presented internationally by the media. We have a community here that has made us all proud. It is an institution of considerable achievement from even what we would call a secular standpoint. Thirdly, it has taken a very proactive attitude towards women, extraordinarily, in the face of the kind of publicity that women get in the Islamic, whenever people are talking about Islam abroad. Well, I don't need to go into that. The whole point is that this community finds women to be the heart and soul, and they have more or less, tried to make women a central focus in the way they present themselves. And finally, they have seen that building a community here requires them to be outgoing, to to develop Islam in a community way, so that they participate in food drives, community food drives, non-political things in the community that help foster inter-community activities. They have discussions with people of other faiths, and they support them openly. This is not a kind of phony thing. They do this with earnestness. And so what from my perspective, after having seen them in operation for, well, more years than I want to tell you about, it's one of Islam's success stories in North America. And I'm very happy that they asked me if I would do this book.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. I mean, for sharing such interesting stories, anecdotes, and facts that many of us are not aware of. And it's interesting, even though I have actually studied this quite a bit, and I love to talk about the Al-Rashid Mosque story, but some of the perspectives you have presented are things that I never actually thought about the way you have presented. So definitely very unique contribution here. So Professor Waugh, tell us, how can people access your book? Where can they find it? Maybe you can waive a copy of a book if you have to have it.
Yep.
Here we have get an idea. We have shown it earlier. Al-Rashid Mosque, Building Canadian Muslim Communities. It's a very interesting title as well. So it's not just about Al-Rashid Mosque. It's actually about the Canadian Muslim community. So how can we find out more about it?
Okay, so it's available on Amazon. It is also available through the University of Alberta, the press itself. The press uses the University of Toronto as its distributor. So in Toronto, for example, you can get this through the U of T press. They have, and it is available in North America in various forms. It's not yet online, I think, as the whole book is not online yet, but it is available, and so people can pick it up even in local bookstores. If it's not available there, you just go to the University of Alberta Press on the website at the University of Alberta, and they will be sure you get a copy of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, once again, Professor Earle Waugh, you have done a phenomenal job with not only with that book, but with the interview today, and in terms of enlightening us on this very unique Canadian Muslim story and Canadian Muslim success story, as well as Canadian success story. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to having you again on this show.
Good. I'd be happy to come again, Taha. Thank you for this interview.
You're welcome. Thank you. Folks, that's about it for today. There's so much we could have talked about this incredible story that Professor Earle Waugh highlighted. I mean, this is a story of integration. This is a story of a success story of community service, community building, as we have heard. This is a success story of entrepreneurship and success story of tolerance and education in our community. So certainly something that we need to pay more attention to, not only in the month of October, which is an Islamic History Month in Canada, but also throughout the year as we ourselves go about building our communities and figure out best ways and best practices when it comes to serving our communities and building our communities across Canada. So once again, thank you for joining us and watching Canada Today. And I'm your host, Taha Ghayur, and I want to also take a moment to thank our producers, Aisha Malik, as well as Saliha Farouk, for their time behind the screens, of course, on this show, as well as CanadaMuslims.com, TorontoMuslims.com, Dawanet for their community partnership. Look forward to seeing you once again next week on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you.